Hi everyone, nice to see so many of you here. It's brilliant to have you. Yeah, as John says, we're going to go through a talk today, a little lunch and learn about eating behaviors in Huntington's disease. Who am I? What qualifies me to be sat in front of you talking about this topic? Well, some of you may already know me, and some of you further may know that from 2015 to 2023, I worked at Leeds Teaching Hospitals. While I was there, I was the lead researcher in charge of their portfolio of HD research studies, things like Enroll-HD, Generation HD2, HD Clarity, familiar names to some of you, I'm sure. And then around the middle of 2020, I started a part-time PhD at the University of Hull. I'm a psychology student by background, so a PhD in psychology made sense for me. And I have a specialist interest in the symptom of weight loss in HD, how and why it happens, and what impacts it has on people. Some of you may have seen me give a talk before. Some of you may have seen some of my posters before. Brilliant to have you back if that is the case. In terms of declarations and disclosures before we get started, I've no direct disclosures to make, and I'm not being paid by the HDA to be here. I work with a company called Care Inc. They have provided me with some of their product for free for the purposes of research, but they don't give me any direct financial benefit either. I suppose the key declaration today is that I am not a clinician. Nothing that we discuss today, either in the presentation or in the Q&A after, is to be considered medical advice. And if you do need medical advice for symptoms of HD, you should reach out to your neurologist or your genetic counselor. What I am is a researcher, and what we are here to discuss is scientific evidence relating to weight loss in Huntington's and the findings of several research studies, some of which are my own, some of which are not. And then just to sort of set what the language for today is going to be. Today's presentation assumes that you all have a bit of knowledge of Huntington's, but otherwise we're trying to be accessible. And if there's anything you don't understand, I'm happy to clarify in the Q&A at the end. Here's a brief synopsis of what we plan to go over. We'll start with a bit of a background to HD and how weight loss intersects with it. We'll go through 4 different key factors that we identified in a literature review that we undertook. We'll go through the results of 2 research studies that I have recently finished, and we'll go into details on 2 open and recruiting studies that some of you might even be able to get involved with. And if they are of interest, please do consider getting involved. And then at the end, we'll use whatever time we have left to have a Q&A. So, a little bit of a background to weight loss in HD. The evidence seems to suggest that weight loss is a very common characterizing feature of Huntington's, particularly in the manifest stage when people start to show symptoms of the disease. Some research has shown that heavier weight and higher BMI is associated with slower progression of the disease. And there's mixed conflicting research about links between how much chorea or uncontrollable movements one person has and what their BMI is. We think that the rate of weight loss correlates to the affected person's CAG repeat length. So for those of you who don't know, the CAG repeat length is a series of CAG repeats on the Huntington gene that dictates whether or not a person has HD and how severe their HD might be. The longer the repeat length, the more likely you are to have a severe form of Huntington's. And we think that more severe forms are linked to a higher rate of weight loss. But ultimately, there's no consensus as to why this happens. There's a lot of conflicting research findings, and we think that the likely explanation is that it's a lot of different things that all contribute a small amount. So to try and learn a little bit more about this, we carried out a literature review, and we think we've summarized it into 4 key themes and factors. The first of those is cognitive issues. So HD-related cognitive dysfunction is normally one of the first symptoms of HD that a person has. It normally occurs before the first outwardly visible signs of the disease, like balance and coordination issues or chorea, start to show. And it typically begins with more difficulties in multitasking or planning or regulating your behavior. As the disease progresses, memory decline starts to follow, and this leads to really rigid thinking, reduced adaptability, and in routine tasks being increasingly difficult to carry out. Ultimately, this hinders essential functions, which includes feeding and eating. The second key factor that we identified was physiological issues. So as we said earlier, there is some research that has taken place in this area before, and there's conflicting evidence as to whether or not BMI and chorea are linked. However, chorea and coordination issues make the practical aspects of cooking and eating a real challenge for people with HD. We'll go into some more detail about that later. And one of the larger pieces of research in this area used a special technique called video fluorography to map the movement of food inside the mouth and the digestive tract of people with HD. And they found that people with HD were more likely to show erratic tongue movements, and there was a bit of discoordination between different stages of swallowing. And we think that that actually might be linked to deficits in memory, because part of your memory is your procedural memory, which is your memory of how to do things and the different stages of doing those things. And that's things like walking and things like swallowing. And a breakdown of your procedural memory basically means that you kind of forget how to swallow, which might be contributing to some of the difficulties here. The third key factor we looked at was issues with psychology. So weight loss correlates really strongly with both depressed mood and poorer ratings of independence and self-efficacy. Several different studies have shown a link between apathy, which is a sort of lack of motivation, and poor eating behaviors, and this suggests that apathy in HD contributes towards weight loss quite strongly. And this is a particular issue because apathy is really highly present in Huntington's disease, as high as 70%, according to some studies. And it's often a lot harder to detect because it's not as psychologically distressing as depression or irritability, which means it can often be quite hidden. But apathy is nonetheless really disruptive towards goal-directed behaviors. This is things like seeking out a well-balanced, nutritious meal or eating at the right times. And then lastly, for the literature review, key factor 4 focused on gastrointestinal dysfunction. So there's been quite a bit of research in this area, and there's some studies that have shown evidence that the gastronomic nerves, and this is the nervous system that deals with your stomach and your esophagus, are damaged in some way, and they aren't telling the body that there are signs of inflammation and irritation in your esophagus and in your stomach. Which means that while around 64% of people with HD displayed some signs of irritation in those areas, according to an endoscopy, less than 32% of patients actually reported any sign of discomfort. So around half of people that have esophagitis or gastritis just don't know or don't notice. And we think that this might actually be linked to the relatively high usage of lansoprazole in people with HD, because esophagitis is impairing the esophageal sphincter. So this is the sort of valve that stops things from your stomach going back up into your throat. And damage to that valve means that people with HD can have increased acid reflux and need to use things like lansoprazole to control their stomach acid. So to summarize all of what we've just talked about there and discuss some of the questions raised, weight loss in HD appears to be common, but we don't know how common. There's conflicting evidence as to whether or not weight or BMI has any actual impact on the progression or severity of HD. Is there anything that we can do to produce evidence to better determine that? And we still don't really know exactly why weight loss is happening. There's lots of evidence that weight loss isn't down to just one thing. And as I said at the start, it's likely to be a lot of different contributing factors. So we want to have a look at trying to define how much of those different factors contribute and see if there's anything that we can do to slow down the weight loss. So to do this, we designed a series of different research studies. Firstly, we had a series of interviews with professionals and service users to gain knowledge about what care for HD and weight loss looks like right now and what their opinions on that are. We then looked at a HD-specific database to identify the extent of weight loss trends and look for the impact of low weight or low BMI on different symptoms related to HD. And then in study 3, we decided we would try to create and pilot a HD-specific eating attitudes questionnaire, which we've called the HD-EAT. And for study 4, we are trialing a new product provided by Doddlebags, a self-feeding aid to try and increase independence and well-being in people with HD, and that one's called FEEDhd. And yes, I am very proud of both of those acronyms. So let's move on to study 1. So this was a series of interviews with a mixed cohort of professionals and service users. All in all, we interviewed 19 different people or groups of people, 10 professionals and 9 people living with HD, 2 of which attended with a companion. From their interviews, we generated 6 themes, and the total write-up of this study totals around 22,000 words. It is very large, and the following analysis is very heavily abbreviated. If you want to read the full document, I am more than happy to share it with you. So, theme 1, which we entitled, It's Just One Big Meal the Whole Day, Really. This looked at common tactics for weight gain in HD and why they might not be working. So calories are king when it comes to HD treatment. Calorific intake is prioritized above all else, at the expense of nutritional balance, at the expense of what you actually like to eat, and at the expense of what you find comfortable to eat. High-calorie milkshakes are really popular because they're super convenient and they've been prescribable quite cheaply for a very long time, but they're very poorly tolerated. The mix of flavors is not particularly great, and the type of flavor that you get is beholden to what your pharmacist has in stock rather than what you actually like. And then olanzapine and other types of antipsychotics are often prescribed because they have appetite-stimulating effects, but because of the nature of those drugs, they can only be prescribed for a very limited number of people that actually have psychosis. So there is limited suitability on what we can do in terms of pharmacological intervention. Here's a few quotes to illustrate what we're talking about. I'll start by reading some of these, and if I end up overrunning, then I'll stop and just give you a chance to read them yourselves on the screen. But we spoke to Janine, not her real name, and she said, yes, so there's breakfast. And then you'll have a shake with a bit of a mid-morning snack or a second breakfast. Then you'll have your lunch and then an afternoon snack. And then you'll have tea, and then you'll have supper, and you have a shake. So it could be seven or eight meals. It's just one big meal the whole day, really. We also spoke to Sarah, again, not her real name, and she said to us that the pharmacy would just provide the same flavor. We're just getting banana, and you prefer it if you could have your chocolate and strawberry as well. That'd be helpful. Yeah, we need to keep asking. The times we have asked that they do try, but it depends on what their supplier has, doesn't it? So you can see there that there's not really much concern given to what the patient actually wants in these scenarios. They're either getting what they get, or they're given it in such a way that they find quite uncomfortable, and they actually have to devote quite a lot of time to eating food that they may not necessarily like. And yes, as we said to the paramedic, it's most people end up getting their calories in with cream or sugar or cheese or having quite a high fat diet because they're trying to get the calories in, because calories are the key focus on weight gain at the expense of all else. Moving on to theme 2, which we've entitled Falling Through the Cracks. This relates to the unpredictability of healthcare professional knowledge and accessibility. We found that there was a real strong recurring theme of professional support for Huntington's either being unavailable, inadequate, or really poorly organized. And we think this was really nicely summed up by a quote from a consultant in genetics that we spoke to, who said, I often feel I write these letters from the multidisciplinary therapies meeting and recommend XYZ to the GP, and then have no real feel until a year later about whether it actually happens. And the disparity of precision is much worse at organizational boundaries. So where the sort of catchment area for 2 different organizations meet, it leads to quite a lot of patients being disadopted by both of those organizations because HD is seen as quite an expensive and difficult thing to treat. So organizations, for one reason or another, are trying to sort of pass the buck when it comes to HD care. And this leads to patients being really sticky with clinicians that they have good experiences with. For instance, we spoke to Steve and he said, I've spoken to the doctor. Yeah, he's a neurologist, and he dealt with my mother with Huntington's and an old head injury I had in 2009. Steve has been seeing the same neurologist for 16 years because he dealt with their mother and with a head injury that he had. Steve lives in Hull and his neurologist is in Leeds. And he makes that trip whenever he has to see his neurologist because he's become very sticky to that clinician because they are a good experience when it comes to HD, not because it's advantageous for his care to travel 2 hours for an appointment. And a lack of a standardized care pathway really makes these issues a lot worse. So we spoke to the genetic counselor and they said, I don't know how it is in other areas, but here they're seen by the genetics team, not by the neuroconsultants at the local hospital. So it's almost like no man's land in some respects, I think, but not all community teams see them. I mean, our team, we accept them as part of the community neuro rehab team, but in some places they're managed by just standard community teams who I think potentially don't fully understand the complexities of it. Moving on to theme 3, which looked at how the sort of psychological and cognitive symptoms of HD contribute to weight loss. Those cognitive issues that we talked about in the literature review are back here. So we're looking at deterioration of executive functioning, their inability to plan, follow instructions, or maintain an organized lifestyle, and psychological issues like apathy, like depression, and also like something called anhedonia. They're very common, they're very difficult to distinguish from one another, and each of them contribute to poor eating behaviors in a slightly different way, making it really difficult to treat. And these issues are made worse in scenarios where there's little or no support network for the person with HD as well. So to touch on some quotes here, we'll start with the one from the neuro rehab nurse at the top. I think people living on their own, or maybe who have unsupportive family, or family who don't necessarily understand what's going on, I think, they would go to the fridge, pick something out to eat if it was there. But if there wasn't, they wouldn't take then any further steps. And I think then this is actually played into quite nicely by the conversations we've had with John and Olivia as well. So John said to us, sometimes I'll mess up with the cooking. So I'll have to get a takeaway. Or sometimes I'll cook things and then forget to actually put the oven on. Or I'll have cooked things before and thrown it in the bin before eating it. While Olivia said, I get a bit overcome sometimes. And one night I got loads of ingredients on the table and things and that ready to be cooked because I've got supper. Other engagements and that, it distracts me to cook them. So yeah, I just don't bother. I can't remember. I imagine that some of these quotes are quite familiar to some of you listening on the call today. On theme 4, we looked at the physical side of things, how physical and practical issues contribute to difficulties. And again, that common consensus that career causes additional calorie expenditure came up. Alongside that, difficulty using cutleries, difficulty with swallowing, and episodes of choking each contribute not only to a reduction of food choice, because you will avoid things that make you choke, like rice, or people would routinely end meals because they would eat until they had a choking episode, and then they would say, no more, not for me, I'm done eating for today, regardless of how much food is left on their plate. And interestingly, there was really little evidence of noticeable symptoms that might indicate gastrointestinal issues, which actually backs up what we found in the literature review, because gastrointestinal nerves seem to not be working properly in people with HD, so they're not going to notice this issue half of the time. In terms of key quotes from this theme, Sophie, one of the service users, said, I put it down to the fact that my body was moving a lot more. It felt like I'd run a marathon every time we went out and did something. And the genetic counselor that we spoke to said they're sort of struggling to functionally actually, manipulate things, struggling to cook, so struggling to actually create the meals in the first place. And again, changing the diet in response to that in a sort of secondary reaction to the fact that they've lost this function. And therefore, they're not actively eating usual meals. There was somebody else I was speaking to yesterday who was talking about how they just had some cereal for lunch and Weetabix, and you think to yourself, well, was that through real choice? And I imagine the answer was probably not. Looking at theme 5, we wanted to look at the impact of weight loss and what losing weight did to people. And we found that it had a really dramatic impact on feelings of social isolation and lowered perception of well-being as well. It's really important to remember at this stage, I think, that food is not just about giving fuel to your body. The way that humanity and culture has grown around us means that food is much more of a social ritual. You will meet friends for drinks, you will go out for dinner with your friends. And outwardly visible symptoms of HD, like chorea and real difficulties engaging in normal eating behaviors, mean that people will withdraw from those scenarios. They will stop meeting friends for lunch. They will stop going to the local pub on an evening. And they will become incredibly socially isolated because of that. And managing these symptoms whilst trying to eat means that people with HD often eat much slower than their companions. So the social situations that they do find themselves in, they find themselves disadvantaged and feeling other to the people that they're with. And it can lead to food becoming unappetizing, cold, something that you don't want to eat. And meals, again, often going unfinished. And these issues are, again, made worse by a lack of supervision. And that need and desire for supervision brings with it an associated loss of independence. I'm sure some of you can imagine how difficult it might be, or it might feel, to not be able to eat a meal by yourself with your friends anymore, needing someone to come with you to help you eat, or not being able to go with your friends at all because you don't want to be in a social situation like that. It really is quite deeply impactful on how you might feel about yourself as a person. Looking at some of the quotes from theme 5, we spoke to Joanne and she said, I used to go out for meals. Yeah, I used to. Not really so much now. We used to do it regularly, which was really, really nice. And then we spoke to Sophie and she mentioned to us that it was a nightmare and it was horrible. You know, you were dreading going out and what you were eating. And one of our consultant neurologists said, you know, patients who struggle with their swallowing, it takes them a long time to eat. It can become quite an ordeal for them or for their partners. They have to concentrate on eating. It becomes a big part of the day for some people. And then the last theme that I want to talk about is on the emerging importance of early identification, monitoring, greater prioritization of weight loss and keeping an eye on your weight, and taking steps to intervene earlier in the process. The professional cohort especially believed that weight loss in HD was very common, almost universal, in fact. And despite this opinion, weight loss is not really seen as a priority, and service users are often shocked by their weight loss upon its discovery. And specialist devices such as assistive utensils, gyroscopically stabilized spoons being one example, dawdle bags being another, anti-spill cups being a third, are sometimes recommended, but not often, not universally, and they're never prescribed because some of them are simply not prescribable. They're not available to prescribe. And then looking into the quotes from here, Sophie said to us, speaking to her carer at the time, she said, I thought you were going to weigh me and I'd still be 7.5 stone. It was a terrible shock to me. I had no idea. I've never weighed myself. There was never any need. And then we spoke to the consultant neurologist who gave us 2 different quotes. They said, I think I would say, you know, it's pretty universal that patients with more advanced disease seem to have lost weight. It tends to be, you know, lots of patients are very thin, aren't they? They don't seem to be bothered by it. You know, the families might be bothered, but they don't seem to be bothered. And I think that speaks to some of the lack of insight that can come with Huntington's disease as well. So to summarize the study interview data, the current treatment landscape clearly takes a calories is king approach to treating weight loss, despite mixed evidence of its efficacy and lots of evidence that common treatments aren't particularly well liked. HD families are often subject to a bit of a geographical roulette wheel because of the segmented and siloed nature of care. And the symptoms of HD make meals not only harder to plan and cook, but also to eat, and they limit choice of both the food that you can eat and where you can eat it. And weight loss is common, but it's often not noticed or prioritized, meaning that really it is one of the invisible symptoms of the disease. So that's what a cohort of professionals and service users said. Let's now take a look at a large data set on HD and see if that is actually backed up in the numbers. So we used the data set from Enroll-HD. I'm sure many of you have heard of it, but for those who haven't, Enroll-HD is the largest data resource for Huntington's disease in the world. It's a multinational study and it follows people with HD once a year from the moment that they consent to the moment that they withdraw, taking observations of lots of different types of measures, psychological, cognitive, physiological, all sorts of stuff. It's a really powerful data set with loads of data in it. And we're using the PDS-6, which is a cut of the data contained on the Enroll platform as of late 2022. And that data has data from around 25,500 participants, 95,000 individual visits, most of those from Enroll, some of which from a study called Registry, which was the precursor to Enroll. The majority of the people in that data set are female at 56%, and the mean age is around 48, give or take about 14 years. Most of the people in Enroll have the HD gene change, and most of them are from Europe. So let's take a look at that data and see what it tells us. Firstly, does the data suggest that weight loss is common? And the answer is yes, but with a big asterisk. So on the left here, this is everybody in the study arranged by visit number along the bottom. So the first visit they ever attended on the left in red, and the last visit on the far right in a sort of pinky purple lilac color. And for this graph on the left, we've taken out everybody that is taking a prescribed high-calorie diet or some kind of medication. And you can see there that weight tends to remain relatively steady for a few years. And then starting at visit number 5, and then more dramatically so in 6, and then even more dramatically so in 7, BMI, which is measured on the side there, it quickly starts to drop off. Very, very quickly, in fact. So let's compare that to the same people, but where we haven't omitted anybody that takes a prescribed high-calorie diet or medication. And that's that chart on the right. And what you can see here is that weight still declines, but it is much, much slower. So from visit numbers sort of 1 through to 7, it's relatively steady, which is a big difference to the chart on the left. And from visit sort of 8 onwards, there is a decline. It's relatively slow. It amounts to 2, maybe 3 BMI points. And what that tells us is that weight loss is indeed common, but that the medication and high-calorie diets that we prescribe are actually quite effective. So the problem here isn't necessarily that the treatments don't work, it's that people don't like the treatments. Moving on, we're going to look at a series of what we call correlates. These are graphs that indicate the relationship between 2 different variables. We've got 2 different lines, and this will be the case for all of the ones I'm about to show you. The red line is a linear regression line. This basically means it's a straight line that indicates the best fit for that relationship. And then we have a blue line, which indicates the best fit for that relationship at different segments. And that's the one that I really want us to focus on. So what we have here is the relationship between BMI and motor score. Motor score is a sort of composite measure measured by the UHDRS, or the Universal Huntington's Disease Rating Scale. It is an assessment tool that forms part of Enroll-HD that looks at things like how much uncontrollable movement you have, how much dystonia or posturing you have, how well you are balanced, what your coordination is like, things like that. And it builds it all up into a composite score of your motor ability. The lower the score, the better motor ability you have, basically. So we have body mass index along the bottom. We have total motor score up the side. This is data from 73,000 people. And because there's so many people, we can find trends no matter how small, no matter how slight, which is one of the best things about Enroll. And what we are seeing here, focusing on that blue line, is that between BMI of 60 to roughly 20, it's a very flat line, which means that there might be some relationship there, but it's relatively weak. And you would look at that line and say, total motor score doesn't really have a relationship to BMI. And that's great. But then when we look at it a little bit closer and we start looking beyond the 20 marker, going down to lower BMIs, so going left, you'll see that that line suddenly takes a really sharp tick upwards. and the strength of that relationship suddenly becomes far, far greater. And what that means is, for people who are underweight or have a BMI of 18 or less, there is a much higher likelihood that they will have a higher motor score, which means that their motor ability is much worse. So there's a really strong relationship here. All in all, it's about 0.22, which is a sort of mild overall relationship. But because of the number of people that are involved in this study, it's a very low likelihood that these results are down to chance. So a lower BMI is associated with a higher total motor score. Therefore, the lower your weight, the much more likely you are to have a worse motor ability. And the inverse of that is true as well. So the worse your motor ability, the more likely it is that you will be a lower weight. And that's the type of relationship that we're looking for. So for each of these subsequent slides, I want you to keep an eye on that blue line. Here we are again looking at BMI correlates for apathy, something we've talked about quite a bit today, and also for independence. Apathy is on the left here, and independence is on the right. So apathy is scored using the problem behaviours assessment. This is a common psychological test. And again, you can see that the line is relatively flat up until you get to about 20, and then it takes another sharp uptick, which indicates a much stronger relationship once somebody is underweight. And again, here on the right, looking at that independence score, this is a self-reported score of how independent you think you are. It's a percentage score out of 100, with 100% being completely independent and 0% being not at all independent. And once again, relatively flat line, not a very strong relationship until you get to under 20, and then it takes a sharp tick downwards, which means that people who are underweight are much more likely to report low independence and not being independent because they're low weight. Again, let's look at two other examples. We've got the mini mental state exam, which is a cognitive test on the left, and we've got total functional capacity, which is a sort of composite score scored out of 13 that indicates how much function you have and how able you are to sort of go about your day-to-day life. And as for both of these, relatively flat line again until we get to about 20, and then a big dip that indicates a much stronger relationship. So here, people who are underweight are much more likely to score low scores on a cognitive test, and they're much more likely to score low scores on a functional capacity test. And then this is the last one I'm going to share. I thought this one was particularly interesting because this one looks at something called the CAG Age Product. So this is something called the CAP score. Some of you will have heard of this before. It's basically a bit of fancy maths that takes the length of your CAG repeat, your Huntington's gene test, and your age, and multiplies them in a certain way to produce a CAP score. And they do this to sort of normalize different people with HD who might have different repeat lengths or might be different ages, so that we can directly compare one person against another. And this shows that regardless of your age and regardless of your CAG repeat, your CAP score is more likely to be higher when you are underweight. So let's take a look at the summary so far. We're not done looking at the database, so this is very much a sort of live summary of what it looks like. We did a test of lots of different things, some of which we've shown you, some of which we haven't. And there are significant relationships between BMI and a whole facet of different measures of HD symptoms. And one of the interesting things here is that psychosis is one of the very few variables that we looked at that doesn't seem to be related to BMI. And I thought that was quite interesting to highlight because people with psychosis who are underweight are one of the few people that we can actually prescribe medication to try and stimulate appetite and resolve their weight loss issues. We did something called a multiple linear regression. This is a special type of test that tries to apply some level of causation to these relationships, which have otherwise just been correlations. So we did that against motor symptoms and BMI, and we found that your motor symptoms, your score on the UHDRS, accounts for around 5% of BMI variance. And we did multiple linear regressions of a few other independent variables as well. So sub out that motor test for something else like TFC or independent score. And while most of them were significant, none of them quite matched that 5% level. But what that shows us is that this is definitive evidence that it is not just one thing that contributes towards weight loss. It's not just motor symptoms. It's not just independence or TFC or apathy. It's lots of different things, all contributing at most 5% of the variance. And the takeaway message here is that there is a significant relationship between having a lower BMI and having more symptoms of Huntington's that are themselves more severe. Lots of food for thought there. So those are the results of two different studies. Let's have a look at next steps as we move towards the end of the presentation now. Those of you who can remember about 35 minutes ago will remember that we did a literature review and we looked at 4 key factors that we'd identified, those being cognitive, psychological, physiological, and gastrointestinal. And we think that, broadly speaking, those 4 themes can summarize much of the things that contribute towards weight loss in HD. But we don't have a way of working out how much they contribute. And we don't have a way of working out if they contribute the same amount to every person, so person B and person A. It could be that cognitive issues contribute to 50% of the weight loss in one person and 10% of the weight loss in another. So let's try and think of a way that we can work that out and make sure that people get the treatment that they actually need. So to do this, we've devised something called the Huntington's disease eating attitude test, or the HD-EAT. So what this test aims to do as a self-report measure, a form that you fill out as a patient, it wants to identify the extent to which those 4 factors contribute towards weight loss and allow for a much more tailored, personalized treatment regime. This test also applies the HD-EAT as a battery of questionnaires to pilot the HD-EAT against other pre-existing, pre-validated eating questionnaires. And it will not surprise you to know that we do not routinely ask people with HD about their eating attitudes or their eating behaviors in any way, shape, or form. In fact, in all of the Enroll-HD study and all of the extra tests that go with the core assessments, we ask one question about eating. It is part of a 25-question questionnaire for the TFC, and it's, can you feed yourself? Yes or no? And that's it. That's where our interest in eating behaviors in Huntington's currently starts and stops. And this, I hope, will represent a change to that. So if that sounds like it's something that might interest you and that you might like to get involved with, then please do reach out to us. My contact details are at the end of this presentation. That's what the test looks like. I designed it myself along with the research team at the University of Hull. And we're working with a variety of different sites to make sure that people have access to this test and can take part. It's run as an online questionnaire. And if you are seeing clinicians or part of Enroll-HD at any of these sites here on the left, so we've got Leeds, Sheffield, Glasgow, Cardiff, Cambridge, Birmingham, the Walton Centre, which I think is in Liverpool, UCL, Leicestershire Partnership Trust, Belfast, and NHS Grampian, as well as the Huntington's Disease Association, then reach out to them and see about getting involved if this is of interest to you. It really would benefit me and also the HD community at large. There's also FEEDhd. So FEEDhd stands for Facilitating Effective Eating with Dodder Bags in Huntington's Disease. And this aims to use dodder bags to see if they are acceptable as an aid to help people with HD who struggle to feed themselves to be able to feed themselves independently for longer, or make it easier for companions to help people with HD at meal times. So dodder bags are reusable, flexible food pouches that already exist. You can already buy them in places like Amazon and the Dodder Bags website. And we want to generate some evidence as to whether or not they can help people with neurodegenerative disorders like Huntington's. They have an anti-choking cap. They have a special spoon attachment that comes as standard. They're BPA-free. They're self-standing. They're freezable, recyclable, leak-proof, microwave and dishwasher safe. They have calibrated sides, so you know how much food you're giving somebody, and they're color-coded, so you can meal prep several days in advance and just know that green is spaghetti bolognese or what have you. This study really came about because we have some anecdotal evidence from people already in the community that dottle bags was useful for maintaining and prolonging independence and self-feeding behaviors and making mealtimes easier for people that have Huntington's disease and their families. And this really bleeds over to this quote here on the bottom right, which is from a Huntington's disease family in the UK. It says, dottle bags are helping me feed my wife with regular pureed food again. Without wanting to sound over dramatic, it's literally making her life more comfortable as I'm easily able to feed her, taking the stress out of what were very difficult meal times. I can also go back to providing a wider, more nutritious range of foods for her. So if this sounds of interest to you or a loved one, or you're a clinician that wants to get involved in this in some way, the aim is that the dottle bags will be tested over a 12-week period. This is something called an acceptability test. So we're not looking for people to use this for every single meal for 12 weeks because that's massively unreasonable. What we want to do is see how acceptable these products are. So if you're thinking, well, I might only use this once every month, that's perfectly fine. Please do get involved. We'd love to hear from you. If you're somebody who's sitting there thinking, I could use this for every single mealtime, this looks brilliant, please get involved. We'd love to hear from you. We want to use this to justify a larger pilot study, build an evidence base upon which we can start recommending them to HD families, and perhaps even look towards them being prescribable in the future if they are acceptable and efficacious. Here's how you can get involved. Some sites are already up and running with this. Again, thank you to colleagues at the HDA. Leeds Teaching Hospitals, Sheffield Children's, Greater Glasgow and Clyde, Cardiff University, Cambridge University Hospitals, Leicestershire Partnership Trust and the Walton Centre are already up and running. We'd be happy to onboard more sites if someone is here that represents a site not on this list, and you can contact the research team directly if you're not at these sites and just want to get involved via the university. So that's the end of my presentation.